Hi, folks. Welcome to the Woodstock Truth Squad. My name is Steve Romine, and you're listening to progressive, community, commercial-free, truly independent radio, and the big one, uncensored radio, here in the Hudson Valley, in the hamlet of Woodstock, New York, on this very famous little station with a big voice, because we speak the truth here on Woodstock 104, that everybody else is afraid to speak the truth on the other radio stations. And so we're very fortunate to have this radio station here in Woodstock, and to be able to have the type of guests that we are going to have on the show tonight. We have a New Year's Eve special here tonight with top-ranking 9/11 activists that have been involved in this fight, this struggle to bring the truth of what really happened on 9/11, and not the false, fact-free story that was given to us by the 9/11 omission report. And so tonight we have three guests. And the first one that I'm going to speak about is Barbara Honegger. Barbara Honegger has been a longtime activist on 9/11. She had held high-level positions in the government. She was a White House policy analyst. She was a special assistant to President Reagan. She was director of the Attorney General's Law Review at the Department of Defense. She was senior military analyst. She was a journalist from 1995 to 2011 at the School of, what was that? I can't even, postgraduate school at the premier Science and Technology and National Security Graduate Research University of the Department of Defense. Now, Barbara Honegger is really a famous person in our history of the United States, because she wrote the book October Surprise, which blew the lid on the Iran-Contra affair. And it actually, if I have my facts right, instigated the congressional investigation into the Iran-Contra affair, and she's become a leading researcher in the 9/11 movement. And boy, are we glad to have her, because she is so, totally on the facts. She has the facts. She's a really adept researcher, and she's made several movies. One of the ones that the latest is Smoke Behind. I'm going to get that exact name of that movie from her when she comes on the show, but I believe it's Smoke Behind the Curtain, and it's about the Pentagon attack. She has it figured out. So she's also a board member of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Now, that's all the lawyers that got together that have put together a petition for a federal grand jury, and got it. We've got the ears of the grand jury. They are willing to look into, and this is what we're going to be discussing tonight with all of these individuals, is the breaking news that the federal grand jury will hear the evidence for controlled demolition of the World Trade Center complex. That's huge, folks, and Barbara Honegger is a key individual in that effort. Now, along with Barbara Honegger, we have David Meiswinkle, and David Meiswinkle has been a criminal attorney, a licensed attorney. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Excuse me, Dave. Dave is a licensed attorney practicing criminal defense, okay, for over a decade. He is presently the president and board member of 9/11 for 9/11 Inquiry, 9/11 Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, a nonprofit organization that seeks transparency and accountability in government. He was a police officer for 23 years and a U.S. Army veteran. Dave also ran for governor against Chris Christie in 2009. He was the only candidate brave enough to call for a new independent investigation. In 2013, he developed a complaint. I can't even read this. A notarized complaint to the State Committee of Investigations in New Jersey on 9/11 and forwarded this complaint to every state legislature, all state county prosecutors, and the state attorney general, and the governor of New Jersey, requesting an investigation into 9/11 and the falsehood of the 9/11 Commission report. And Dave has a radio show online that you can check out. It's Quantum Matrix Radio. Check that out online for Dave and his show. Along with Dave, we have Richard Gage. And everybody on this show, I would imagine, knows Richard Gage. I mean, he's been on this show, I think this is his 4th or 5th time. And he is a lead architect, founding a member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. They are number 3076 now. And Richard, along with Barbara, are some of the early people in the movement that really have brought this to another level, a very professional level of investigation and research, and for that we give them both thanks. And so we have Richard on with us too. They'll be calling in at 7:30. So make sure, if you know anybody that you think would like this show, make sure you give them a call and tell them to tune in, because this is a rare event to get all these people in one place like this, and especially on New Year's Eve. I mean, they found the time to do that, and for that I thank them personally. I want to give everybody a little prep before we listen to them speak about, one of the key pieces of evidence is nano-thermite. And, it's actually called super-thermite or nano-thermite. And I'm going to let somebody explain it who has really looked into this. And here we go with his presentation. I'm going to tell you his name at the end of the show. All right, but here we go. He's going to speak about the peer-reviewed study and everything associated with the nano-thermite research. Here we go.
People aren't aware of the fact, and many of those that are aware of this fact that I'm about to mention ridicule it because they don't know the facts behind the fact. So, in Paul Harvey's style, I'm about to give you the rest of the story. A lot of people don't even realize that there's been a paper submitted, a peer-reviewed work, performed by 9 different scientists in independent laboratories who have verified that nano-thermite has been used. It was used on 9/11/01, and it was part of what took down the towers. Now, some of the people that are aware of this have claimed, well, that's just ridiculous. Nano-thermite couldn't have caused that big of an explosion. But you see, they're not taking several things into consideration. First of all, our government, the United States government, did not even take samples of the dust from the World Trade Centers on the day that it collapsed. However, some independent scientists did collect dust from the trade towers after it crumbled into dust. So, what happened? There was only so much dust to go around. They could test it for a lot of things, but they knew that nano-thermite, which is extremely fine thermite, It's extremely fine thermite that's been weaponized, and because of its fine texture, and because of its fineness and the small particulates involved in making nanothermite, it has a much faster and hotter cutting power. The nanothermite was not used in order to cause the great explosion that crumbled everything to dust. It was used to cut the steel metal core from top to bottom of the World Trade Center. That's what it was used for. But there was only so much dust to go around, so they had a choice. They could test it for regular explosive, or they could test it for the nanothermite. And they chose to test it for the nanothermite properties. And what they found, according to Mr. Harrit, who led the study, he was an independent Dutch scientist, a very well read man, extremely good reputation, extremely credible man. He led this study with 8 other scientists, and they discovered that there was not just nanothermite, there was burnt and unburnt nanothermite. So we don't just have the residue from the burnt, we also had actual unburnt nanothermite that reacted just like regular nanothermite would act when it was combusted. They've actually tested it, they combusted it, and it's been verified through very strict testing that this is indeed nanothermite. There's no question about it, and it was used to cut the metal at the World Trade Center. Now, there was these men could not get their paper published. The mainstream peer-reviewed journals would not allow that study to be shown in peer review. So they had to take a long way around to get this information out there and get it peer reviewed. One man that did give this paper peer review was a very well respected man. His name is David Griscom, Dr. David Griscom. Now, David Griscom is an exceptional scientist. I want to give you a little bit of his credential here. Dr. David Griscom, that's Griscom. Anybody can look this up. He's had a stellar, over 33-year career as a top military scientist at the top U.S. Naval Research Lab in D.C. He also had a stellar record with NASA and several other major labs around the world. He was a DARPA team leader for over 2 years. He's authored over 200 peer-reviewed articles and was the principal author in over half of those works. He's also peer-reviewed personally over 600 works himself. His 33 years at the DC Naval Research Lab as a top physicist, as well as his 2 years as a DARPA team leader, also a successful career with NASA, and the broad scope of his writing and peer reviewing adds weight to this man's ability to know and identify military-grade explosives. His peer-reviewed work has been cited over 10,000 times in other peer-reviewed works. He's distinguished as being one of less than a handful of scientists who've scientifically examined actual moon rocks. He has a Hirsch index rating of, well, last I checked, it was at 58. Now, what is a Hirsch index rating? In order for someone to be considered a successful scientist, then after 20 years, they're expected to have at least a Hirsch index rating of 20 to even be considered credible after a 20-year career. So if their Hirsch index rating is under 20, they're not even considered a credible scientist. Griscom has at least a 58. A rating of 40 on the Hirsch index scale is considered to be a top scientist. with a very successful career, and he would have written several peer-reviewed articles and been highly cited by his peers, and they're also considered to be most likely found working in major labs. Now, this paper is just one of the over 600 that he's peer-reviewed. And he concurs, this top military scientist with a career of over 33 years in a top military lab as a top military scientist, he concurs with Harrod and his 8 associates that nano-thermite was found in the dust of the World Trade Center. He actually peer-reviewed the work, he peer-reviewed the process, he peer-reviewed the findings, and he concurs nano-thermite was found in the dust. Now he's calling on the government to come clean about what really happened that day. So, he's actually, even over the years, they have offered $1,000 to any scientist that will come and debate this issue against Griscom. And the government has not been able to find a single scientist who's willing to step up and stake his career on a debate against Griscom. So, by default, these debates have been set up every year, and by default, Griscom has won every single time because there's not a credible scientist out there that will step up to the plate. Now, Google this if you like, and I'll add the link here, but it's active thermite material discovered in dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center catastrophe. There's 9 scientists who have signed off on this, and then David Griscom himself. Now, what did the government do in order to debunk Griscom? Well, like I said, not a single scientist, not a single one, not one scientist would step up to the plate against Griscom. The government had to find a failed scientist with nothing to lose at all in order to try to debunk Griscom's work and the work of these other 9 scientists. Now, this would be little Jimmy Millett. Little Jimmy Millett, James Millett, has an index rating of 16. That's compared to Griscom's 58. This means, recall, I told you that you have to have a Hirsch index rating of at least 20 after a 20-year career to be considered credible. 40 means that you're a top scientist working in a top lab. Griscom's at 58. He's nearly, that and half, 50% more. Anyway, Millett has a 41-year career and still doesn't rate as credible. His index rating of 16, he has an I index rating of 21, while Griscom enjoys an I index rating of 128. Millett has only been cited in other peer review work 1,033 times in 43 years. Griscom's work has been cited over 10,000 times. Why is it that James Millett doesn't even why doesn't he even come up to rate to debate Griscom? Because Millett is below standard. He isn't even considered credible. He is debunking, he debunked the work done by Harrod and peer-reviewed and agreed upon, concurred with by Dr. Griscom. His story is that these nano-thermite chips are red paint chips. Good Lord, red paint chips do not blow up and combust like nano-thermite. And that's what they're trying to hide from you. These chips were actually tested by Harrod and Company, and they did combust as nano-thermite would. Red paint chips are not going to do that. Red paint chips is actually just totally ridiculous. Come on. Not a single top scientist is rising to the occasion to defend little Jimmy Millett. So, folks, there you go. Compare Jimmy Millett, little Jimmy Millett, to the massive credentials of Dr. Griscom.
Okay, so that's what I wanted the audience to hear, was that the evidence for nanothermite is pretty solid. There's a debunking myth floating around, but it has no credibility. And the peer-reviewed team has all the credibility, backed by David Griscom and his incredible reputation as a military research scientist. So we know it was nanothermite. Now that's just one bit of evidence, and a very important bit of evidence, but just one bit of evidence that Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry has assembled and put together in a petition to the DA, Department of Justice, and the federal to convene a federal grand jury. And the news is that that petition was evidently successful. And the grand jury, the federal grand jury, is going to hear the evidence for controlled demolition. This is like huge news. And Richard Gage, and who has been doing the research for years, putting it together, and Barbara Honegger has been doing this for years, putting it together, and working with Dave Meiswinkle and the other lawyers to get this as a case before the grand jury. I mean, this is awesome, and this is what we're going to be discussing tonight with these folks who have taken time out on New Year's Eve to present what's happening, the latest development around this issue. And I think there's more than what I just told you. What they're gonna present is some even more new information and new developments that have happened that I don't even know about. So on that note, if we have all the callers on the line, no, we don't have all the callers on the line. Oh, we don't have Dave yet. Okay, but you know what? We got 30 seconds. And I do want to say, everybody, if you don't know about Richard Gage's website, it's ae911.org, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, 3,076 of them so far and counting. And it's a great website to go to. Movies, 9/11, explosive evidence, the experts speak out. And fantastic movie by engineers and architects, and even a Nobel laureate in there, and military people too, part of the movie, of experts saying it was controlled demolition, and certainly wasn't anything else. I mean, what the government is trying to say. There may have been some other factors and techniques and devices that we used, but we definitely know from the science that we can prove controlled demolition was part of the demolition of those buildings. And I know there's a lot of conjecture about other types of devices like nuclear and laser and NEWs. I mean, what do you call it? DEWs, direct energy weapons. I'm not saying they're not, but we can prove this. We can prove this. So this is what we're working on. This is what Architects and Engineers works on, is the controlled demolition. So on that note, I want to welcome Dave, Barbara, and Richard to the show. And thanks for calling in, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
And I want to let Richard Gage speak first, because he and I have been working together for years on this, and I want him to say whatever he wants to say to start out the show. Are you there, Richard?
He was.
Oh, there we are. Hi, Steve. It's an honor to be on the show. Thank you so much.
Well,
I'm just delighted to be on with Barbara and Dave from the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, because these are the folks that can reach into the establishment and the courts and bring the evidence that we've been assembling for 12 years now. And by the way, that website is 911truth.org. So I want to make sure.
Oh, I didn't say
gets out
truth
there.
day? I didn't say truth, Richard?
Yeah, you missed the truth part.
Oh, sorry about that.
That won't, yeah, because you won't get there.
You'll get to the
So-
other site.
Yeah, we've been all around the world in more than 30 countries
Wow.
and speaking to groups of 100 to 4,000 in 600 presentations about this evidence, doing everything we can to get it out there. We've been to every congressman 4 times over the last 10 years.
Wow.
And given them our DVD, our petition signed by more than 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. So on this show, I'm looking forward to giving you the evidence for all 3 of those, and I can do that, highlight it in about 8 minutes later on. But just in terms of introduction, it's been 12 years now that we have been assembling this evidence, which proves that the skyscrapers, as you mentioned, were brought down by controlled demolition. And 2 years ago, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry came to a panel in New York, a conference called 9/11 Justice in Focus. And 12 of them interviewed about a dozen of our experts. And this testimony has been codified and put up into 57 exhibits. And these have been included into this petition you mentioned. And as you mentioned, it's going not to the DA, but to the U.S. District Attorney in Manhattan. And it's very exciting because, as Barb and Dave will highlight, they actually agreed to impanel a grand jury of 23 people. This is a special grand jury. So with that in mind, maybe we can introduce our other guests, and after that, I can give you your audience the evidence, because there's always a few newcomers, Steve, in even your audience. So that's important to get the foundation.
Definitely. So, Barbara, welcome to the show, and I'm so honored to have somebody on the show that used to be the assistant to the president.
Yeah, to Reagan even.
Yeah, right. Wow.
That was a long time ago, folks. Well, thank you, Steve. Yeah, it's an honor to be on your show, too, and I hope you have lots of listeners, because this really is an historic breakthrough for 9/11 Truth, not only for the victims' family members and the survivors of 9/11, especially at the World Trade Center on 9/11, but for the whole world, really, because the lie of who attacked our country on 9/11, which is proved by the forensic evidence that is marshaled in the petition and the evidentiary exhibits, which are part of the petition, that has gone to, it's just the U.S. Attorney, not the U.S. District Attorney, just the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Now, that is the federal jurisdiction for Ground Zero, where, of course, the World Trade Center Towers and World Trade Center 7 were on 9/11. And so it has gone to the federal court and the federal U.S. Attorney for the jurisdiction of Ground Zero and 9/11. And on November 7th of this year, just a little bit less than 2 months ago, we were pleasantly surprised, frankly, when the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry received an official letter from the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York saying, we will comply with the federal law that requires us, the U.S. Attorney, to convene a special criminal grand jury, and we have reviewed your petition and exhibits, and we will present them to the special criminal grand jury. Now, that happened on November 7th, and beginning on December 11th of this year, so about almost exactly 3 weeks ago, another historic event happened, and that is that Richard Gage's Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, their organization partnered for the first time with another organization, and that's our Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and we are in the middle, actually at the very end today, of the joint fundraising drive for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. So quite frankly, we're going to pitch to your listeners to please help us. Help us go to our website, either one. It's a joint fundraising drive, and please donate. We realize that people who are activists are not wealthy people, but any amount that you can donate will be a tremendous help, and you can do that at either of our websites. So you can go to Architects and Engineers website, which is AE911truth.org, or you could go to the Lawyers Committee website, which is LCFOR911.org. So that's AE911truth.org or LC4911.org. And it'll be obvious where you can, at the Lawyers Committee website, the latter one I mentioned, you can clearly, there's a link to click on the petition. There's a link to click on the 57 evidentiary exhibits that are part of the petition, and there is a link to click on to read and actually see a scan of the U.S. Attorney's letter dated November 7th itself. So we're asking for your help, and this is an historic breakthrough. I honestly believe that it is the most important step that the 9/11 Truth movement has taken. We are officializing, we have just officialized all of that forensic evidence that architects and engineers and our patriotic and courageous whistleblowers and experts over the past 17 years have brought together, and we have packaged it in a legal document that is now with the U.S. Attorney, and it may have already been given to a federal special criminal grand jury. People need to know that grand juries are secret proceedings. So for all we know, it's already been impaneled or is about to be impaneled. And I'm sure here in a minute we're going to hear from our president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry about what a grand jury is and what we can expect and what we hope, how we hope to interact with the U.S. Attorney and the grand jury. So in a nutshell, that's how I wanted to open.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Richard. And now I'd like to introduce Dave Meiswinkle, lead attorney for Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. So, welcome, Dave.
Right. I wouldn't say I was a lead attorney. I'm one of the lead attorneys. Our litigation director is Mick Harrison. I am the president, however.
Okay.
And on April the 10th, as we mentioned, or as has been mentioned, a grand jury petition was submitted to the U.S. Attorney and in the Southern District. That was April 10th. And in July the 30th, it was followed up with an amended grand jury petition, which added some additional crimes. The crime in the April petition had to do with federal law criminalizing bombings of places of public use in government facilities. In July 30th, the amendment included federal law criminalizing acts of terrorism, transcending national boundaries, federal law criminalizing providing support to terrorists, and a federal law criminalizing the killing of a federal agent or employees. Now, these counts all had sub-counts had to do with conspiracy and aiding and abetting. On November 7th, we received a letter, which, as Barbara said, we were excited and a bit surprised that it said, we have received and reviewed the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry submissions of April 10th and July 30th, 2018. We will comply with the provisions of 18 U.S.C. 3332 as they relate to your submissions. Now, what that statute does is it creates an obligation, a duty, on the part of the U.S. Attorney to take the evidence that was presented to him in this petition and to present it to the grand jury. The grand jury is selected and is composed of 23 lay people, and it's taken usually from the voter registration list, my understanding. A grand jury, in order to have a quorum, you need at least 16. They are strictly secret, and they can last for up to 18 months, and even longer. They can get an extension. The significance of this, as was really underlined, and the excitement, is that the entire narrative has possibly changed now, and it has changed just by the acknowledgement by the U.S. Attorney that this evidence and this petition and the theory of the petition basically is that bombs, explosives, and controlled demolition was responsible for bringing the giant skyscrapers down, the North and South Tower, Building 1 and 2, and Building 7, which was a giant in itself, the WTC 7. And the official story is that office fires caused by jet fuel caused the weakening of the steel, etc. And that has been the conventional wisdom, and I'd like to say, I'd be nice to say, the falsehood that has permeated our society since that time. This is revolutionary in the sense that it totally takes the most likely hypothesis and puts it front and center. The least likely hypothesis, that the buildings came down because of fire, is it's impossible. And Richard will talk to you about that these steel-structured high-rise skyscrapers can't come down just because of fire. And what can bring them down, however, is explosives, bombs, controlled demolition, and elements like nano-thermite, which was found in the dust samples that Richard will talk to you about. So this is very, very important. So much has happened because of the narrative that was given and believed by the American people, to the extent that our Constitution is barely recognizable now. That if you look at what's happened to our freedoms that perhaps most people aren't aware of, they've been incredibly eroded. And as I like to say, that the day that they claimed that there was a hijacking of airplanes, there was a hijacking of our Bill of Rights and our Constitution.
Right on.
So in part, this will hopefully rewind the situation at least back to the time before 9/11, and that would be healthy for all of us.
Right on, Dave, about the part about what they really hijacked, along with the everything else. One thing I wanted to ask you is how many lawyers are in the Lawyers Committee, and from just out of curiosity, my own curiosity, is Dan Sheehan a member of the board?
Well, Dan Sheehan's a friend of ours, and we're an organization that has at present 8 board of directors, and we're talking about, we can expand that. Our bylaws allow us to do that and to add additional. So you are actually, we're addressing a situation which is in the process of changing, in that it's not static, it's growing, just like anything grows or moves, it changes.
Right.
So there is a good core of attorneys that are committed and to support the board. The board is, as I said right now, the board of directors that basically decide on that this grand jury petition was what we wanted to present. It wasn't the work of just one man, although our litigating director did a lot of the drafting. It went around to all of us, and we added parts and subtracted parts and And we've had a consensus that this is the document we wanted to present. And we do that with all our work that we're going to present. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
but,
it does. It does.
Okay.
But my next question is, I mean, am I incorrect to say this is huge?
Yeah, no, this is huge, and you'll hear, and I mean, I don't say I get a kick out of it, but I know Richard. I hear Richard talk, and he's got an energy that I haven't heard in a while, and he always has a high energy level, but he's very excited about it because a lot of the evidence in this petition was developed by the architects and engineers and Richard Gage over the years, and they've been plowing in the vineyards or whatever, and hopefully that everyone will be a benefit to be able to reap what they've sowed. They sowed the seeds. It made it easy for the lawyers to assemble the evidence that was out there for the most part and start to put it together. There are other crime scenes, and we're not going to talk about them here, but someday the lawyers committee may be involved with them, but they don't have the development of the evidence like we have in New York City.
Right.
And there's no one better. I mean, Richard has made more presentations than anyone in the world on the evidence on Ground Zero. I believe it's over 600 some presentations.
Wow.
So when I see him excited about this, I know we're striking the chord. We're right on path, and we are now inside the system in a sense that before there's a matter of credibility, but the U.S. Attorney, appointed by the President of the United States, has thought this important enough to give us that letter and acknowledge that they're going to fulfill their duty to make a presentation of this petition to a special grand jury. And according to that statute, I read 18 U.S.C. 3332. So, no, it's historical and it's exciting, and, we'll just have to... we'll pray for the best and move forward. I mean, we're preparing other things too, but no, it's very important, incredibly important.
Well,
I would like to add something, Steve.
Yes,
to
yes.
answer your question. Yeah. You asked how many attorneys we have. The core group is our board, and actually, Dave, I believe we now have 9 since Dennis McMahon has joined us. So we have a board. That's the core group that does the work, frankly. But there are between 35 and 40 attorneys who are members of our broader organization.
Wow.
And they meet by conference call once a month as opposed to twice a month for the board. And, of course, the board also has special conference call meetings and such. But it is the board that does the yeoman's work of all of this, yes.
That's music to my ears, and I'm excited about all of this, and it's after all these years, it's just so unbelievable that it's happening. We're seeing it happening right in front of us, and I personally want to thank each one of you for all the work that you've been doing and continue to do. You're all an inspiration.
Right, and I also want people to understand that we're not just talking about the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York agreeing to present our petition and exhibit to an already convened grand jury. We're talking about the U.S. Attorney specially convening a new special criminal grand jury just for this purpose.
Wow.
Yeah. It's huge, as President Trump likes to say. It's huge.
Yeah, I like to say that too. It is huge, and this is.
Well, think about Steve. Think about what the grand jurors are going to hear. Now, just picture yourself sitting around this big table and listening to these 57 exhibits, and one at a time. And here's what's in some of them. They're going to hear that 118 first responders are documented having been interviewed less than a month after 9/11, talking about explosions at the World Trade Center and many of them seeing flashes of light. And these explosions, most of them, they're very specific interviews. Explosions before the World Trade Center came down, talking about the towers, as well as Building 7. There's witnesses of explosions before it came down. Now, let's jump to Building 7 real quick, because this is the smoking gun of 9/11. They're going to see that a third tower came down. Some of them heard something about it, but they don't really know. In fact, most architects and engineers know nothing about the third worst structural failure in modern history. So here, they're going to be watching on video this building, after witnesses hear explosions, dropping like a rock. This is a 47-story skyscraper, part of the World Trade Center complex. Wasn't hit by an airplane. It drops like a rock straight down, uniformly, symmetrically, at free fall acceleration in under 7 seconds into its own footprint, just like the old hotels in Las Vegas as they're coming down. In fact, we'll show them this side by side. And so, and yet 8 years later, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, 7 years later, says in 2008, this building came down by normal office fires. Wait a minute. Not only does it look exactly like a controlled demolition, we've never had an office fire or any fire bring down a high-rise ever before 9/11.
Or on 9/11.
Or on 9/11. Thank you, Barbara. So we have a huge problem here. And they're going to be faced with this problem. They're going to be having the same cognitive dissonance that each and every one of us on this call had 17 years ago, 18 years ago, on 9/11, watching these buildings coming down, thinking something's off, something's wrong, and then having to deal with the possibility that these explosives and incendiaries, as I'll point out, were intentionally set. Probably not by fundamentalist hijackers on the airplane either. These are three of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon. So here's Building 7 with the evidence in it of extremely hot temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit in the aftermath of this pile. And so the first responders, the iron workers, the structural engineers, never seen anything like this in their lives. They're all documenting these extreme temperatures, which we very carefully lay out in one of the exhibits, or several of them, to the grand jurors. And they're going to be faced with, well, where did these temperatures come from? Office fires only get to be about 500, maybe 1,000 degrees. We're talking 2,800 degrees, documented by many, including the U.S. Geological Survey, who documents these billions of these previously molten iron microspheres throughout all the World Trade Center dust. And this is iron, elemental iron, not even steel, but iron. Where does 10 tons of molten iron come from? I mean, really, they don't know. They don't even speculate. NIST speculates that it, actually, they don't even speculate where the iron comes from. They speculate where the heat, the massive heat came from. They said these fires increased in temperature down in the pile while they were smothered by these incredible piles of powdered concrete, which is amazing. But the USGS documents it, as does R.J. Lee, an environmental consulting firm, and they say it formed during the event, not before, not after, as NIST claims, not before by the iron workers whose welders' rods emit little balls of iron here and there. No, this is 10 tons. And they say it was formed during the event. It's a signature element of the World Trade Center dust. In fact, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all these tons of, all these billions in each little sample of these previously molten iron microspheres. And then FEMA documents in their Appendix C of their Building Performance Assessment Report in 2002. This is another exhibit these grand jurors are going to have to wrestle with. They document a hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel. They document a silver dollar size hole, liquid molten iron invading the steel. So what are they going to think of? They're going to ask where this came from. Well, molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. It's very clear where it came from, but they just don't say this in their Appendix C report, and then this takes over the investigation, throws out the Appendix C report, comes up with a whole theory for destruction by fire in all three of these buildings. Essentially fire in the Twin Towers, too, because the planes dumped most of the fuel outside the building is where it burned up. 10% burned inside the building, burned up in 10 minutes, they say. And so these buildings are burning for an hour or so, and after the planes hit, is normal office fires with some damaged columns. So NIST says, well, here's what happened. Those fires, which they say were raging, but the videos show otherwise, they're black smoke. And they say that the floors softened and collapsed, and then the whole upper section, in the case of the North Tower, 15 stories, drove down the whole rest of the building at damn near free fall acceleration. 2/3 of free fall acceleration, almost as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the South Tower. Doesn't decelerate when it hits the cold, hard steel below. It goes faster and faster and faster. But they say that that's what drove it down to the ground, but you don't see that. What you see is the upper part completely destroyed by telescoping in on itself. There's nothing left up there to drive the rest of the building down at any rate. But it does anyway, because this is when there are additional explosions heard by the first responders. They say like a belt, all these explosions all the way around the building. And we can see in the videos hurling 4-ton structural steel sections laterally in every direction at 80 miles an hour, landing 600 feet away, destroying high-rises all around them. And so this is incredible because gravity works down. Well, something else is working to throw these materials outward as well as produce explosive ejections 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the destruction zone, even as it's traveling at almost free fall acceleration straight down. So in other words, those columns are being severed, exploded outward. And by the way, all of them almost are outside the footprint of the building, up to 600 feet, as I mentioned. So what's left? That's 100,000 tons of the weight of this building, the steel. If it's not down inside the pile, then what drove the building down to the ground? So the juror's going to say, oh, maybe it was the concrete floors, because there was 110 of these concrete floors. And yet, we'll show them that not 50 of them, not 10 of them, these acre in size concrete floors, 4 and 8 inches thick, are found at the bottom. Not even one. They're going to say, well, where'd the concrete go? They're going to look at the videos, and they're going to see that it's pulverized in midair. 90,000 tons of concrete in each building, pulverized in midair, drifting through a 3 square mile area, landing 4 inches thick, this concrete powder, all around Lower Manhattan. And by the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete isn't found inside the perimeter of the building, but in a 3 square mile area from river to river across Lower Manhattan, what drove the building down? It wasn't the steel. We just saw that. It's not the concrete. There's almost nothing left to drive the building down. So they have no theory whatsoever that makes any sense, and that's what the jurors are going to see in addition to the other evidence, as you highlighted in the beginning of this radio show, that nano-thermite, which is a high-tech form of thermite made in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories, is found in these red-gray chips that you highlighted. Red on one side, gray on the other. When they put it into a heater, they thought it was just paint, but it comes up to a magnet. And they get real curious. They put it into a differential scanning calorimeter, a heater, and it ignites at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. And it produces what? Molten iron microspheres. The same molten iron microspheres that were found by the U.S. Geological Survey and R.J. Lee, but they couldn't identify where they came from. So now we know where they came from. So the jurors are going to be confronted with a set of experimentally reproducible, self-corroborating set of evidence that if the perpetrators are found and subpoenaed and brought some indictments against, they could go to jail for a long, long time.
Hold that note, Richard, and we're going to do a station ID.
You're listening to WIOF-LP Woodstock 104. The program is the Woodstock Truth Squad with Steve Romine, and we have on the phone live Barbara Honegger, Richard Gage, and Dave Meiswinkle.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, that's a summary of the evidence that I wanted to present to you, and I would like to hear from Dave Meiswinkle and Barb. What are the obstacles to getting indictments, and how do we get indictments, and who do we get indictments about? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that your listeners are going to have too, I imagine.
Well, I would like to just jump in before Dave answers that as an attorney. I would just like to let people know that in addition to all of the evidence that Richard Gage has just mentioned, imagine again that you're one of those 23 extraordinary, ordinary Americans in that special criminal grand jury coming up, and they are also going to learn from our petition and our exhibit. They're going to learn another astonishing fact, and that fact is that there were massive, deep basement explosions in both World Trade Center towers before the planes hit. Dozens and dozens and dozens of stories of those. 14 seconds before, deep basement explosion in World Trade Center 1, before the plane hit. In World Trade Center 2, deep basement, 17 seconds before the plane hit. Massive deep basement explosions. And there are multiple witnesses to this. And in our evidentiary exhibit, there are video testimonies from those eyewitnesses and ear witnesses who were in the deep basement of the buildings before the planes hit, when these massive, massive explosions went off. So any kindergartner knows that a plane impact that happens after deep basement explosions can't be responsible for those explosions. The explosions happen first, then the planes hit. These are pre-placed explosives before the planes hit and after the planes hit and just before the towers came down.
Yes, and I want to add one thing to that. Also, Richard mentioned about the molten steel. The fact that not only was it underneath all this rubble, but there was 1 million gallons of water that was poured on it by the fire department, and it stayed molten. I hear different figures, but I think around 6 weeks to 2 months, something like that.
Guess what? Thermite is used by Navy SEALs because it can cut through steel underwater.
Right.
Yeah, and the fires went on for 3 months.
3 months. Okay. I mean, that right there, I mean, jet fuel and office furnishings which have fire retardant in it cannot keep molten steel molten for 3 months. That's the smoking gun.
I was up there.
There are a lot
I
of
went up to
smoking
the
guns.
site
Yeah.
in November, and I walked around it, and they had it sectioned off, so you couldn't barely see into it at all. There was a big fence up there. There's a lot of people up there, and the thing that was most astounding to me, this was almost 2 months later, it was still smoking. The smoke was coming out of it. And I said, oh, man. And as we walked around, it was near a church there, and the lady was passing these little masks out to protect you. People were putting masks on, little masks, and so you would walk around it. And later on, I found out that one of the characteristics of nano-thermite is that it basically creates its own oxygen and can burn underwater. So that was really a surprise to me. But as Barbara said, that there were people that experienced explosions in the building, in the basement. One of them happened to be Willie Rodriguez, who became very famous because he saved many people and helped the firemen. He was the janitor in the North Tower and had the keys that could help facilitate escape. And he himself was almost killed. He had to dive under a fire truck and was buried for a while. Fortunately, people saw that, and he was dug out. But he said there was explosions in the basement. In fact, one of his co-workers ran into the office that he was in, and his skin was dripping off his body, and Willie rescued him. And this was, I believe, Willie was in the first sub-basement, and the fellow came up from the one below. There's 6 basements, at least, I believe, in those towers as you go down, down, down. So he was very clear, and in some of the statements are if utilized as exhibits here, that there were bombs in the basement, and they went off prior to the airplane hitting. Now, curious, too, is that, as was mentioned, Richard mentioned 118 firemen that experienced bombs and explosives in the building. And now that's pretty incredible, all these firemen inside there. And they are not being utilized as witnesses by this commission that was established, that Philip Zelikow was involved with, and Tom Kane. So having a background in criminal law, you would really like to, or any kind of law, it doesn't even mean criminal law, just having a background in common sense. You have people that have experienced explosions and bombs who are experts at that themselves, who have handled numerous fires. And 118 of them claim there's bombs in there. And you have another 40-some or so. It was a total of 155 first responders. So you have police officers, EMT people saying they heard experienced bombs too. And you have lay people like Barry Jennings, who was in Building 7, and he was almost killed there. This was in the morning hours, bombs in Building 7. And the official report never mentions that. That is so, come on. Never mentions that. And I would, I'm not a betting man in many ways, but I would bet that most people don't know that the firemen, 118 of them, said there was bombs in there, and that some other lay witnesses have said there was bombs in there, and the official investigation doesn't look into explosives, as the requirements or protocol for fire investigation and also police investigation would be to secure the scene. The fire prevention would be to prevent spoliation of evidence, so that certainly they would test for, normally, under this type of catastrophic event, for accelerants and explosives. And had they done that, and had they preserved the metal and the steel and checked that out, they'd analyzed all that dust, in part, I believe, caused by that pulverized concrete. They would have found those millions of microspheres that Richard's talking about, and they would have seen all that metal deformation, some of which the FEMA talked about, but they didn't do that. They decided to accept the least possible hypothesis, an impossible hypothesis, and push that off on the world as the truth. And we've been, inhaling that lie for all these years. And as a result, we've changed the whole fabric of our country, and we've not addressed the murder of 3,000 innocent people that day, of approximately 3,000 people that day. It is really a travesty in every which way. It does not speak highly of our country. What will speak highly of our country is if we reverse that and we analyze it properly. Understandably, this was a psyop in many ways. The trauma was so great, people don't want to look at it. It's almost unbelievable. And it was done with the theatrics of a major movie production, in a sense. It was stupendous. It was something that would make you want to look away and say, I cannot believe this. Well, maybe it took 17 years for people in law enforcement to say, maybe it's time we look at it, really look at it for the first time. And that's what's exciting, at least for me. For the first time now, we have a U.S. attorney and a special grand jury to look at this. And maybe it took 17 years to get over the horror of it. And as Richard said, they're going to be surprised. They're going to be doing backflips and saying, my God, how could all this evidence be here and the government give us this stupid story, this fairy tale, and this blatant lie?
Right.
And you know what? For anybody who's already gone to the movie Vice, that's just out in theaters on Christmas Day.
I saw it.
And, yeah, and it made me sick to my stomach.
Same here.
It's about Dick Cheney, and at the very end of the movie, it is based upon, at the beginning of the movie and the very end of the movie, they push the official story of 9/11, and the Cheney character in the very last scene turns to the camera and does a soliloquy and basically says, this is almost a verbatim quote, the Cheney character says, there were 3,000 people burned to death on 9/11, and in the trade towers, and he uses those massacred Americans to then justify the attack on our civil liberties, on our Constitution, the torture program, the unilateral executive trying to make the presidency into like a king or a pharaoh. He uses the official lie of effectively at the World Trade Center to justify all of these horrendous things that man did. It made me sick. It's a piece of propaganda.
I couldn't even stay for the whole movie. I was actually the first person that walked out. Not because the movie was so horrible in production or anything. I just couldn't stand the propaganda, as you say, glorifying him to a degree and giving him any credit because he's a scoundrel.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So anybody who sees the movie, just so you know, they're lying about what happened on 9/11 big time and using it to justify all of the horrendous things that Dick Cheney himself did to our country.
I just want to add what we just heard from Dave. I want everybody to realize you're hearing that from a lawyer who defends criminals, people accused of criminal activity. And Dave was also a police officer for 23 years and a military veteran. So he's the last person that wants to talk like this or say anything unless the facts are so overwhelming. You have to say it if you want to stand up for the Constitution and speak the truth.
That's right. And I just want to remind your listeners that you can read the petition for yourself and all of the evidentiary exhibits, the 57 exhibits that are part of it, by going to the Lawyers Committee website. And again, that's lcfor911.org, and it's obvious where you click to read the petition, the grand jury petition that's been accepted by the U.S. Attorney for the federal district there at Ground Zero. And you can also click to read the exhibit, and you can also click to see the letter from the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York dated November 7th, in which the U.S. Attorney has said that they would comply with the law and that they will be convening a special criminal grand jury and presenting our petition and evidentiary exhibits to the grand jury. You're going to be able to read all those exhibits, see all those exhibits, read the petition. I do recommend that if you click on the link for the petition, probably wise for a layman to go to about page 22 and start with the evidence. The first part is the legal framework for the petition, and then the evidence starts right around page 22.
It's incredible information for anybody out there who wants to know what really happened and put in such a concise and succinct way in this petition. It's just amazing when I first read it. And kudos to you guys. I mean, it's unbelievable what you've done. And I also want to say I myself have a lawsuit that I'm involved in, that I'm representing myself in court, so I've learned a little along the way. And one thing I know is about moving the court. Whenever you make a motion, you're moving the court. And for you to do this, put this petition together, and see the justice system move now because of what you've done has to be so gratifying, huh?
Well, it is. It definitely is. The grand jury is really, really the people's court. It's sort of like the fourth arm of the government. It's not controlled by the executive, the judicial, or the legislative, and it's mentioned in the Constitution. It's in the Fifth Amendment, the grand jury, but it's very gratifying. You're right about the courts, and at least they're going to be looking at something that, like we've said, is going to stun them in some ways, but there's nothing there that's being spun. That's one of the things that I was impressed most by architects and engineers, is that they were interested in the facts. They're interested in the truth, and they approach it scientifically. So there's nothing here political. There's nothing being spun. When you look at the exhibits, they speak for themselves, and that's thrilling in itself, that you're getting undiluted truth here.
Well, Dave, who tell us about the indictments? I mean, how does that happen? The grand jury's interested in who might have been responsible for this crime. How are
Thanks, Richard. We've submitted we're in the process. We're working on it, which should be very soon. A supplement that's going to be what we call People's and Material Information. There are some general descriptions in the petition, but we're going to become a little more particular and specific. The grand jury has a lot of power. We don't have that power. We can investigate on our own, but we can't subpoena documents. We can't command people to come before us and answer our questions. We can't make deals with people that maybe are a little shady or maybe very shady, and they want to save themselves. So we're not in that position, but the U.S. attorney is, and the grand jury is. And the grand jury can basically instruct the U.S. attorney to do certain things. They want a certain type of investigation. So that's again, that's all secret what they do. What we can do as attorneys, and what we're doing, and what we need is, as Barbara said, funds to continue on. It's a volunteer group, but people can contribute at the Lawyers Committee, or LC4FOR911.org. But we are continuing to do Freedom of Information Acts. These are actions that can help connect more of the evidence. That's what they'll be doing. They'll be directing, or they'll be connecting the dots. Now, we've asked the U.S. Attorney in our correspondence with them to allow us, the attorneys, to make presentations to the grand jury. If they would allow us, we would be glad to do that, and we would also like to meet with them, and they may have questions because they may not be that familiar with this area. And some of our attorneys, and certainly Richard and Barbara are, they're experts, and so the attorneys, some attorneys know a heck of a lot, and we may be helpful in that regard. But other things that we'll be doing is preparing a federal declarations, or these are written under oath testimonies and etc. That for the experts that Richard represents in part, or represents largely, and a lot of his colleagues, and we'll be also developing a statement forms, etc., for lay witnesses, and we'll be hopefully being able to make presentations. We have to raise money too for. We don't know what to expect. We have plans if this isn't successful in a way that we think it should be, to hopefully redirect it so it is successful. So that's some of the things that we're doing. What the grand jury is doing, I mean, we're hoping that we expect that they're going to look at the evidence, and that evidence is going to raise questions in their minds, and they're going to instruct the U.S. Attorney to, they want to follow this lead up. And that lead will be to certain people and certain organizations. And when they eventually do their investigation, they will hopefully ask for charges to be brought against certain individuals and or organizations. And in order to do that, they have to have a probable cause, and that's a reasonable suspicion. And that's not that hard to do. I mean, people are always getting indicted. We know that, and so that doesn't mean they're guilty. Yeah, but that means that there's enough evidence there that they should stand trial for the charges. Now, the charges that were mentioned were mostly they're all bombing charges, and they're all connected too. We threw the conspiracy charges in there too, and aiding and abetting, so that it's not just one person involved in this. It would seem that there's a network involved, and then we also have to realize that this concentrates just on ground zero, but this was a crime throughout a number of states, in particular with the Pentagon down in the Washington, D.C. area, and with the plane in Shanksville area in Pennsylvania. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but or the concern. The grand jury is mostly, I've actually testified at grand juries, and basically what they do is they, as a police officer for the most part, and I've been able to actually, as an attorney, get some grand jury transcripts, which are very hard to do because of, the nature of the case. But basically they bring you in, and there's not a lot of people in there. There's just the grand jurors, and you get sworn in. You have your U.S. attorney would be in there. The judge is not in there. And then they ask you questions, and then they go from there. And they may ask you to leave, but stay outside because they may have more questions for you. And then they ask you to come back in, and they ask you more questions. Now, that's being a friendly witness because I was testifying as a police officer, but some of these people will be testifying as, people that may be involved with the crime. And that'd be a little bit different as for I don't know exactly what the procedure is because I've not seen that. Again, this is a secret procedure, but I think it'd be a little bit different. But they have a lot of power. They can cause you, they can make you come there and answer questions. That's pretty important.
Dave, I want to ask you, do you submit with this petition, was there any type of something similar to a deposition where you put a list of names and they have to consider that and possibly themselves depose those people or summons them?
Well, as I said, we're working on it now on a supplement that is what we call people of material information. And that's basically what you would be talking about. In the petition, there are references to the general areas. Like one of the areas you'd be concerned with would be security. How did this happen? Because if there's bombs in the building, these are highly secure buildings. Supposedly, it takes weeks, if not months, to set charges. All right. Was there contractors in the building? What kind of work was being done? Was there asbestos removal done? Was there work on the elevators? Was there electrical work being done? Those things are in the petition right now. You can read them in a general way. We're not naming names right now, but we will be. All right, we'll be giving them more specifics, and we give them a it's sort of like a roadmap, maybe. All right, because a lot of these people, this will be totally new to them, and to the U.S. Attorney, it will be new to them in a sense. So it'd be prudent and wise to give them more direction, and we gave them a lot there to start to digest, but we didn't want to necessarily overwhelm them. But we are proceeding to answer your question and actually do something similar to what you just mentioned.
This is huge, folks. This is huge. And wow. That's all I can say is wow.
That's what we said when we got the letter from the U.S. Attorney. Wow.
I could see why.
I would like people to understand, your listeners, why grand juries are secret. As Dave Meiswinkle mentioned, the president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry earlier in this show, it is the case that the grand jury is secret. And the reason the grand juries are secret, they come from English statutory and common law. And grand juries, both in England, in Britain, and in the United States, are secret because their purpose is to decide, is to look at evidence and decide if there is sufficient information, sufficient evidence to indict an individual or an organization or individuals for a crime. Now, in a grand jury, the individual or organization is not allowed to have a defense attorney. It is completely one-sided. It's purely prosecutorial. So, obviously, if a grand jury decides, well, there's a complaint that came in that this individual may have committed a crime and we looked into it and there's nothing to it, they don't want it to be public because they didn't even find enough evidence to charge someone with a crime. So the whole purpose of the grand jury is it's secret because they are looking at the evidence to see if there is sufficient information to charge someone, to ask the U.S. Attorney to indict.
Right.
Now, once the indictment happens, it will probably be public. If there are indictments, those will almost certainly be public. It's very unlikely that those would be sealed. And I think, as Dave Meiswinkle mentioned, the criminal grand jury can be impaneled for as long as 18 months, and that can also be extended. So we're talking about we only got the letter less than 2 months ago, about 7 weeks ago, and it takes quite a bit of time to impanel a special criminal grand jury. The U.S. Attorney has to go to the voter rolls or the DMV rolls. They have to randomly select individuals. They have to vet those individuals. It costs a lot of money to convene and hold a criminal grand jury. A lot of money. We're talking about major taxpayer dollars being put to this process. And that's also important for people to realize. The U.S. government itself is investing in this project.
Wow, that's huge. And you guys had asked me to keep it to an hour, and I want to let you know it is an hour. I mean, I'd love to have you on the rest of the night, but I just want you to know an hour has just passed, and whatever you want to do is good with me.
Well, it's New Year's, guys.
Right. For me, I have to go.
I have to go,
You guys have
unfortunately.
Okay.
To do. That's great. I apologize. It's New Year's Eve,
Thanks
and
for having us
I've got a
on,
date
and the Lawyers
waiting.
Committee is really appreciative.
Not you, Richard.
I'm engaged now. Actually.
I know that.
Life is
Congratulations.
good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just want to tell everybody, you know, especially you guys, that after you leave the show, I'm going to play out Peter Michael Ketchum and his testimony from NIST to finish the show with. So isn't that cool?
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful. Great.
That's great. So let us remind people, seeing as the three of us will be leaving in a minute or so, just remind people, if you can contribute, please, to the Lawyers Committee for this great historic work.
Definitely.
We are in a joint fundraising drive with the architects and engineers right now. Today, actually, is the last day of our 3-week fundraising drive. So if you can, go to either of our websites. It's obvious where to donate. Be sure and say that it's for the Grand Jury Project. And you can either go to the Lawyers Committee website, which is lcfor911.org, or Richard Gage's Architects and Engineers website, which is ae911truth.org. And please donate generously. Help us. Help us succeed.
By all means, please do, folks. And I thank you, folks, for taking the time to come on and speak about this so important subject as we start out the new year. This is an important subject, and thanks for everything that you've been doing.
Thank you,
Thanks a
Steve,
lot,
and
Steve.
Happy New Year to you.
Thank you.
Steve.
I'll get in touch with each one of you. I have some questions for you. Have a happy new year.
You too.
All right,
And
you
a
too.
one.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, that was incredible. Conference call with 3 top 9/11 leading activists in the world. These guys are the Richard. Excuse me. Richard Gage is just a powerhouse activist, unrelenting, because he's working with the truth. When you work with the truth, you gain power. You gain power. You have power. There's power in the truth, and if you believe in it, and you don't let up, stay persistent, and that's what I'm seeing here, folks. I'm seeing something happening just like what happened with the Vietnam War protests in the 60s. It was a major struggle. It seemed like this giant wall that you had to climb that was just impossible to climb, and very few people to help you. And it just kept building and building and building. And all of a sudden, people are starting to jump on board. Famous people, Robert Kennedy and movie actors and other people. And then we had Daniel Ellsberg. Okay? Well, same thing's happening here, folks. Now we've got lawyers and architects and engineers and White House whistleblower and a petition that succeeded in getting a grand jury, a federal grand jury, to hear the evidence for controlled demolition. This is huge. And the people that are responsible for that, directly responsible for that, were just on our show. We just had them on our show here on Woodstock 104, the most famous little station in New York State, as far as I can tell. I haven't heard any other station as famous as this, with this big a voice for a smaller station. I mean, this station puts out some incredible stuff. And I wish Randy was here to hear this show tonight. And
Yes, definitely.
yeah,
Especially with this development, a grand jury and the proof of nano-thermite there, and even in Building 7.
yeah. Another thing that people need to understand, when we talked about the molten steel that stayed molten for 3 months under 1 million gallons of water, it stayed molten. Okay? Kerosene from the planes, folks, can't keep anything burning underwater. Water puts out a kerosene fire. And nothing's going to burn that's kerosene's burning, which is what jet fuel is. Jet fuel, I should explain it, but jet fuel is refined kerosene. So water puts out a fire. Can't put out an electrical fire, and it can't put out fires that is, being burned because of nanothermite. Or it can't put out a nuclear fire either. China syndrome.
Or burning magnesium.
Yeah, it can't put that out. Okay? So, but the point is the fires stayed, the burning material, steel, stayed molten for 3 months underwater. But not only that, I bring that up and they say not only that, they all happened in the exact 3 places where the 3 buildings collapsed. So building 1, Tower 2, we know those buildings collapsed. And a lot of people don't know a 47-story building, which was called Building 7 or the Solomon Brothers building, collapsed. And it wasn't hit by a plane. It wasn't hit by a plane, but it collapsed in 6 seconds. 6+ seconds. Richard Gage says under 7 seconds. 47 stories of solid concrete and steel. You know what the incredible thing about Building 7 is that I found out? I'm always finding out more stuff. It's unbelievable how much more information keeps coming out. But, when they built the other buildings, and almost all structural steel buildings in New York, in New York and even in the country, uses steel I-beams. Steel I-beams. Okay? If you cut a cross-section of it, you see which shape of an eye. It's not solid steel, like square steel, 12 inches by 10 inches. It's not that kind of a beam. It's an I-beam. But do you know Building 7 used solid core steel beams? Wasn't I-beams in Building 7. So what could possibly bring down a 47-story building in under 7 seconds? Under 7 seconds. And just collapse as though nothing was in the way. As fast as you could drop a bowling ball from the top of the 47 stories to the ground, that's how fast the building fell. Okay? Well, guess what? Every floor of steel has a certain amount of compressive resistance where it's holding up. Okay? To push that down takes a force. And the forces, it had been holding itself up since the 1990s. Because steel catches on fire or the building catches on fire does not mean that steel, where the fire isn't, the whole building wasn't on fire, folks. Okay? On the 6th floor, there were some random fires. The videos only show some random fires on the 6 floors. Yet that building collapsed in 6 seconds, 6+ seconds. Okay? So something was used to bring Building 7 down. And if they brought Building 7 down, they probably brought down the other 2. I mean, it's not hard to understand. And so when it comes down and then the steel stays molten, there was no jet fuel in Building 7. There was no jet fuel in Building 7 because no plane hit Building 7. So the question comes, how did it catch on fire? How did Building 7 catch on fire? Okay? And they say, well, the steel flew. Oh, yeah? You know what? The closest building was 300 feet away. So a steel beam that from building Tower 1 and 2 that maybe had some material on it that was on fire flew 300 feet, and that the wind of flying 300 feet didn't put out the fire on the steel, and that somehow caught Building 7 on fire. And then once it was on fire, the fire ignited and it lasted for 5 hours and it collapsed in under 7 seconds. And now we have the building that caught on fire, Building 7, supposedly from flying steel 300 feet away, and that building collapses in 6 seconds. And then what do we have? We have molten steel on the ground, under the ground, in the basement. All the steel is molten, and it stays molten for 3 months. Now, how does that happen? There's no way that something flew 300 feet, caught Building 7 on fire, caused the building to burn. It collapses in 6 seconds, violating all the laws of physics. It's not hit by a plane, folks. It collapses and then stays molten for 3 months under 1 million gallons of water, because that's how much water was poured onto the World Trade Center complex to put out the fires. How does that happen? It cannot happen because we know there was no jet fuel in it. So the only thing in Building 7 was the building materials of itself. Okay? And those building materials all have fire retardant in it. Okay? And that building did not have anything. There's nothing. Here's another thing to understand. When you have an open air fire, and that's what they were on all 3 buildings. They were open air fires. You could say, well, Building 1 and 2 caught on fire because of the planes. But you can't say that about Building 7. There was no plane. And then something caught it on fire. And then when it did catch on fire, all 3 buildings were on fire. You have what's called an open air fire, or an uncontrolled burn. An uncontrolled burn. When you have an uncontrolled burn, it only goes up so high, to around 700 degrees. Okay? You can't get an open air fire above that temperature. So when you have a foundry where you burn, where you want to make steel molten, you have to have a controlled burn. And a controlled burn is where you make it get hotter than an uncontrolled burn, because an uncontrolled burn won't get the temperature hot enough to make steel molten. So you have to use something that will force oxygen into the fire. And that's what they do in foundries. They force oxygen into the fire that they created, controlled burn, and that oxygen being fed will create a very hot flame. Now, that's what we do with torches when we burn. Okay, I have a set of torches. I can burn. Is we're feeding oxygen into the fire to make it get hotter. And that's the only way that you can get temperatures that high. You can't have an open air fire in Building 7, Tower 1, Tower 2, all 3 buildings part of the World Trade Center complex, and have all the steel in those buildings become molten, because you can only do that with a controlled burn. I mean, isn't that amazing? That's the smoking gun right there. Like Barbara Honegger said, there's more than one smoking gun, not just the molten steel. But the fact that it stayed molten for 3 months, but how did it get molten? How did it get molten? Well, not from any normal office fires, because that's all Building 7 was normal office fires. So please, anybody out there who hasn't woken up yet to the fact that Building 7 was controlled demolition as well as Building 1 and 2, but Building 7 was classic controlled demolition. There was no planes involved in Building 7, and the steel stayed molten for 3 months, and Larry Silverstein, who owned the lease on the World Trade Center complex, which is another whole story I'll get into, Larry Silverstein announced on mainstream television. He said, I'm going to quote him. He said on, I think it was NBC or whoever it was, Peter Jennings, I'm not sure who he was talking to, but he said, we considered the terrible loss of life. And he said the fire commander called me up and said, we don't think we can put out the fires. And he said, I thought because there's been such a terrible loss of life here, I think the smartest thing to do is just pull it. And he said, and that's what we did. And right after he said, that's what we did, and we watched the buildings, that's what we did, and they did that, and we watched the buildings collapse. Okay? That's what he said. But then, after he realized he put his foot in his mouth and he basically admitted to a crime on mainstream television, I don't know if it was later in the day or in the week, and they asked him again. He says, I wasn't talking about controlled demolition. I was talking about pulling the firefighters out. No, that's not what he said. You look at the videos on YouTube of him saying it. There's plenty of them. And what he said was, the fire commander said there's been such a terrible loss of life, and maybe the smartest thing we should, and he said, well, maybe the smartest thing that we should do is pull it. He didn't say them. He said it. Maybe the smartest thing we should do is pull it. And he said they did, and we watched the buildings collapse. Now, the thing to know here is that the firefighters had evacuated the building early in the morning. Right after the planes hit Tower 1 and Tower 2, they had, and it caught on fire, I guess. They abandoned Building 7. They left it. There were no firefighters in the building at around 11 o'clock. And when he was discussing pulling it, was around 4 or 5. Okay? You just have to look at the facts. And he was not talking about... Then you add in the other facts. You got to add in the other facts. You want to just look at that. You add in the fact that 6 weeks prior to 9/11, Larry Silverstein hardballed. He wanted a change in his insurance policy on the World Trade Center. Out of the blue, he wants to change the insurance policy on it. Okay, well, I can understand that. You want a better insurance policy. No, Larry Silverstein wants an insurance policy that guarantees against terrorism. Okay? And he hardballed this. He wants double indemnity paid out in cash. Okay? And then when he goes to court after it happens, he says, my buildings have been hit twice. So that's a double event. So he gets all of that, and he walks away with somewhere, I can't get the exact, a confirmation, but I know for a fact it's between $4 and $7 billion in cash Larry Silverstein walked away with. Between $4 and $7 billion in cash. Everybody else's lives was totally wiped out. Larry Silverstein made between $4 and $7 billion in cash. He announces on public television that pull it. And they did, and we watched the building collapse. So he announced that he did the controlled demolition. And the other fact to know is that controlled demolition takes, for a 47-story building, there's only a handful of people in the world, a handful of teams in the world that can do a controlled demolition, and it takes them 2 months to prepare a building for controlled demolition. But somehow Larry Silverstein talked to the fire commander, who, by the way, the fire commander in New York City, the fire department does not do controlled demolitions. They're not trained to do controlled demolitions. They have nothing to do with controlled demolitions. And we had Rudy Dent, a trained fire marshal, on this show state that, and you can see him say that. If you want to find out and verify what I'm saying, go to YouTube and look up a firefighter blows the lid off the 9/11 cover-up. Firefighter blows the lid off a 9/11 cover-up. The fire department is not trained in controlled demolition. So why is Larry Silverstein lying and saying that the fire department told him it's been such a terrible loss of life? Maybe the smartest thing to do is just pull it. And we did, and the building collapsed. We watched the buildings collapse. Why is he lying like this? Straight out to the public. And then changing it later on, and then collecting $4 to $7 billion. And I forgot to mention, he was a regular visitor daily, without fail, his own set of tables at Windows of the World restaurant on top of the World Trade Center every single day without fail with his whole family for breakfast every morning, without fail. But on 9/11, without fail, his whole family and him weren't there. Now, how much evidence do you need to see? This isn't conspiracy theory. This is called forensic investigation here, looking at the facts. And ask yourself this, of all of that stuff that I've just mentioned, why wasn't Larry Silverstein ever questioned before the 9/11 Commission? Doesn't anybody think that's kind of strange? That Larry, in spite of, he walked away with $47 billion. He wasn't at the event when he was always there, and he got this insurance policy in place, and he said controlled demolition, pull it on the radio, on public TV, and the guy's not even questioned. Okay, so there's enough to ponder right there. We're going to put on the testimony by Peter Michael Ketchum. Peter Michael Ketchum was a mathematician that worked for NIST. NIST is the organization that put together the phony, or what we call the 9/11 omission report. They're a federal agency, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they did the 9/11 Commission report, and he was a member of that agency. Longtime member, incredible mathematician, believed the story till he started thinking about it. And after a while came out and gave public testimony which you will hear right here. Can we put that on, Felicia? So it's about 30 minutes. So here we go with Peter Michael Ketchum, NIST person, NIST, I don't know what you call him, mathematician, but a major person in the NIST organization that put out the phony 9/11 omission report. And here's his testimony confiding to the public in the fallacy of NIST and what they did. Here we go. So we're trying it out here, and what a night we've had here on New Year's Eve, boy. So glad to have those folks on the show. I'm going to get each one of them back on the show individually. And let's see if this is
No
it.
tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to
Yes.
fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th. According to a 3-year comprehensive building and fire safety investigation just completed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST.
Could one use a controlled demolition on any building? Sure. Did it happen to WTC 7 on 9/11? No, it did not.
Building 7 was no ordinary building. Among other key tenants, including several intelligence and law enforcement agencies, it also housed New York City's Emergency Operations Center.
Have you had anybody come up to you and say Building 7? Have you had Building 7?
No, no.
Walk around. Be on television a little more. You'll get the Building 7 guys.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
My name is Peter Michael Ketchum. I was born and raised in Wisconsin. I've spent much of my life in the high performance and scientific computing world. I worked at NIST for 14 years. Starting in 1997, I initially joined the High Performance Systems and Services Division, and a few years later was moved into the Mathematical and Computational Sciences Division. I also was chair of our Applied Mathematics Seminar Series and hosted that for several years.
This is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
In the United States, standard setting is led by industry, but NIST plays a critical role in supporting, defining, and fostering that effort and coordinating it with the federal government. Over our long history, we have cultivated deep scientific roots that cut across a whole range of disciplines.
NIST was given the task of investigating the World Trade Center collapses. that of course happened on 9/11.
Ranking Member Hall and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on NIST's role in the investigation into the collapse of the World Trade Center towers.
I was not involved in those investigations or writing those reports, but I was certainly aware that that research study was going on. NIST's role, as I understand it, was to investigate the collapses of the 3 World Trade Center towers, and by that I mean towers 1, 2, and 7, and determine why they had collapsed.
The collapse of these towers was the worst building disaster in human history. Engineers, emergency responders, and the nation did not anticipate and were largely unprepared for such a catastrophe.
I began to look into this in July of 2016. It actually came up in a conversation with a friend that I'd known for 30 years, and she mentioned something along the lines of, gee, do you realize there is some growing evidence that the official 9/11 narrative may not be quite what we all thought it was? I didn't do anything for about a month. I think I just let it sink in. But in the middle of August, I felt very compelled to start investigating. And in a very short amount of time, it became clear to me that NIST's investigation of the collapse of the World Trade Centers was not a sincere and genuine study. And I quickly became furious. First, I was furious with myself. I couldn't believe that I had not noticed this before. How could I have not noticed this for the last 15 years? And that fury then quickly transferred to NIST, my former employer, who I had always thought very highly of, and always felt that NIST did research of the highest integrity. So to see what they had done, what NIST had done with the World Trade Center investigation and report, left me stunned.
Good morning. I'm here to summarize the findings from our 3-year study of the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. Before I tell you what we found, I'd like to tell you what we did not find. We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
You want to call your mother or something?
You gotta get back. I know that. You gotta get back. All right. I know.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
What became immediately obvious to me was that there was overwhelming evidence that all 3 of those towers, 1, 2, and 7, collapsed due to controlled demolition. And the NIST reports focused almost entirely on reasons due to fire and the associated plane crashes and jet fuel.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
What I saw was that the most likely cause, controlled demolition, was not investigated at all. In fact, it was dismissed in 1 or 2 sentences within the report.
For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dat heeft een team gedaan van experts.
This is the first time that we're aware of that a building over 15 stories tall has collapsed primarily due to fire.
What is special about Building 7, and I think why it has gotten as much attention as it has, is because it wasn't hit by a plane. So that cannot be used as a reason for why the building collapsed. Now, it did have some fires. They weren't terribly notable fires. They were rather modest, in my opinion. And to complicate matters even more, there was an obvious foreknowledge on the part of some people that seemed to know that this building was going to come down.
You're listening to WIOF LP Woodstock 104. The program is the Woodstock Truth Squad with Steve Romine. We continue.
Building right there, the brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next. In fact, one officer told me they're just waiting for that to come down at this point.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
Rescue workers pushed people away from the scene.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Now, all these stories are not compatible. You cannot have a heavily built steel frame high-rise collapse due to modest fires. If that were the case, it would be extremely unusual for that to happen. So unusual that you could not possibly predict when or if it was going to happen. At the same time, you have people more or less waiting for it to come down, and in some cases they had reported it had collapsed before it actually did.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed. There were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani.
The point is, that building is heavily built. There would be no reason to expect it to come down.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable, and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
We knew from the beginning of our study that understanding what happened to Building 7 on 9/11 would be difficult. It did not fit any textbook example of that you could readily point to and say, yes, that's why the buildings fell.
I believe there is a quote at one point that the NIST investigators said something along the lines they were having trouble getting a handle on why Building 7 had collapsed. NIST is extremely competent. So to have NIST be baffled by the collapse of a building that had only modest fires and exhibits every characteristic of controlled demolition, if they say they were coming up empty-handed and couldn't figure it out, that's not believable. NIST put forward a model for the collapse of Building 7 that appears to me that they were grabbing at straws.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Now, when I was a kid, and many people today are probably too young for this, but there was a cartoonist called Rube Goldberg. He drew cartoons of these machines that did a very simple thing in an incredibly complex way. And it was meant to be humorous.
How does this door opener upper really work? You see, waiter places cat B on pile of dirty dishes A. Now cat B sees mouse C. Of course, this is a stuffed mouse because he must be used for the next waiter.
It was meant to spoof the aspect of human nature that sometimes makes things far more complicated than they need to be. And these were called Rube Goldberg machines or Rube Goldberg devices.
And sets off bomb G, opening door H very gently.
The explanation that is given by NIST for the collapse of Building 7 sounds like a Rube Goldberg device.
You could have beams that are here that are restrained from expanding, prevented from expanding because of this column here, for example, and that can buckle. And you see an example of a buckled beam right here.
One column slides off of its seat on a few particular floors, and within a matter of moments, there is some chain reaction, like a set of dominoes, that brings the building entirely down.
It is possible that you could have a local failure as a result of a connection failing. But the likelihood of that failure dragging the entire building in such a fashion that all the columns would fail at the same time is an impossibility.
Impossibility?
Yes.
And you can see on the screen the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining columns.
Steel frame buildings don't do that. That doesn't happen. It's just fantasy land.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Does the model that NIST produced for World Trade 7 match what we actually saw? No.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caved out. The building followed after that.
And, you know, I'm reminded of the old fairy tale of the emperor has no clothes. Everyone is watching the emperor go by and is being brainwashed to believe that the emperor has a beautiful set of clothes on when actually he's wearing nothing but underwear.
The emperor has no clothes on!
Now, what we see in the NIST model, first they only play the first few seconds of it. We only see a little bit of the building beginning to collapse. It is extremely atypical to build a computer model and create an animation of that model and to show only the first part of it. Why not follow through to the end? Where's the end? And what we do see doesn't match what we saw in reality. The animation for the NIST model of the collapse of World Trade Center 7 has the sides sort of kinking in and the top of it kind of bending funny. That is not what the video of the collapse of Building 7 shows. Building 7 came down almost straight down.
This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
One of the things I noticed in NIST's investigation and reports is this fixation on collapse initiation, as if all that was required was to investigate up until the point that the collapses initiate. No, there's a lot more to the story than that. In fact, that's stopping just when it's getting interesting. But NIST makes a 1 or 2 sentence summary along the lines of, and then the building collapsed completely.
We were charged with finding out the cause of the collapse. And we found what happened. I think we've scientifically demonstrated what was required to initiate the collapse. Once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate that, what is clear from the videos.
To investigate only up to collapse initiation is only doing part of the story and leaving out a great deal.
Now, it may be that something fell off the building It may be that something has fallen. We don't know, to be perfectly honest. But that is what you're looking at, is the current. That's the scene at this moment at the World Trade Center. Stan Daler from ABC's Good Morning America is down in the general vicinity. Dan, can you tell us what has just happened?
Yes, Peter, it's Don Daler down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
That should be it. Thanks very much.
It has completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
If the top of the building became unstable due to the weakening of columns, one would reasonably expect the top of the building to start to lean, start to creak, connections start to break, and the top of the building would simply fall off to the side and come crashing down on the buildings next door. And the rest of the tower would remain. That's what one would expect. Instead, we saw something quite different. It is not reasonable to think that the weakening of some columns near the impact zone could somehow lead to an entire building collapsing entirely down on itself, symmetrically into its own footprint, with nothing left but bits of dust. That's not plausible, that's not reasonable. Watch some of the videos of the collapses. Look for several things. Look for sudden onset. When the collapses start, they happen very fast and they complete within 10, 11, 12 seconds. Second, look at the symmetry. These buildings come straight down, or almost straight down. Asymmetric damage does not lead to symmetric collapse. It is very difficult to get something to collapse symmetrically because it is the law of physics that things tend towards chaos. Collapsing symmetrically represents order, very strict order. It is not the nature of physics to gravitate towards order for no reason. It will gravitate towards chaos. It is very difficult to get a building to collapse symmetrically.
Mark Loiseau has been in this family business all his life. He knows what it takes to bring a building down.
The largest steel structure we've taken down, which I think is still a Guinness record, is the J.L. Hudson building in Detroit. It took months to design it. It took months to prepare the structure for the placement of the explosive charges. Months.
Third, look at the rubble that is left. It is not big pieces of steel, big chunks of cement. It is fine particles.
Surprisingly, so little rubble. Where did all the rubble go?
The concrete was pulverized, and I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powdered 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
And they might also look at those videos to see the explosive nature of those collapses. you can see essentially a wave of explosive demolition traveling down the building as it collapses. Explosions coming out of windows. Huge chunks of steel perimeter beams flying hundreds of feet off to the side. Steel does not fly off to the side hundreds of feet due to gravity. Gravity works vertically, not laterally. There has to be a force there, pushing it to the side. Otherwise, it would just fall down to the ground. It'd be like dropping a ball out of a window. It would just fall straight down. Why did NIST issue a report that seems to do everything it can to avoid investigating the most likely cause, in this case being controlled demolition? Why would NIST avoid that? Why would they try to do everything they could to avoid that? The only thing I can do is make some guesses, and I emphasize the word guess. Perhaps they were coerced, perhaps they were pressured. I don't know where that coercion or pressure might have come from, but it is not typical of NIST to do anything short of excellent. NIST is extremely meticulous about their research, and by necessity they need to be. That is what they excel at. This report does not fit that pattern at all.
We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered.
One thing I think to understand is NIST is a really excellent place to work. And for many of the people who work there, this is a really good position and they have a lot to lose. It is not all that hard to begin to pressure people, make offers they can't refuse, coerce them, and depending on the person or people involved, that can be anywhere from very subtle to very overt. The best I can do is speculate that something of that type happened.
We conducted this study without bias, without interference from anyone, and dedicated ourselves to do the very best job we could. And in fact, I would suggest that the public should really, at this point, recognize the science is really behind what we have said.
So why didn't I see it? I think the painful truth is that I was living in blindness and ignorance as to what had actually happened. I didn't give it much thought. I heard the official narrative, and like many people, I believed it.
Do you know anything about the cause of the explosions that brought the two buildings down yet? Was it caused by the planes or by something else?
We believe that it was caused by the after effects of the planes hitting the buildings. We don't know of an additional explosion after it.
And I am ashamed to say that, but that's the truth. Once I took a look at it, it leapt out at me. This was not a case of some subtle differences or subtle discrepancies or differences of scientific opinion that needed further investigation. This was glaring, clear-cut.
Getting behind a car. Don't have oxygen.
I think what has allowed the official story to stand for this long is a combination of several things. One is complacency, another one is fear, and the third is ignorance. There are probably many people that just have not looked at it, don't understand it. They just simply are not aware. In other cases, it's complacency. They have a sense of what might be going on, but they're maybe not too interested in putting the effort into finding out. And there could be others that have a very strong sense of what they think is going on, but they are gripped in fear, they're paralyzed in fear. The reason that I have spoken out about this is very simple. I spoke out because I believed it was the right thing to do. I have no other motive. It would be nice at this point if someone who is currently a NIST employee would also speak out, but that is up to each individual there to decide. What I am seeing is that with respect to the World Trade Center collapses, the official narrative is beginning to unravel. I think there is a good chance that that unraveling will continue and perhaps accelerate. But it could be highly volatile. If it does continue to unravel, I think there could be some very painful revelations that will be very hard for our country to accept.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
And I don't in any way make light of that. It could be very painful.
Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen.
But the wounds of 9/11 have remained unhealed for too long. And they are festering and rotting, and they are infected. When you have a wound on the body, one of the first things you do is you wash it out with hot soapy water. And then you bandage it up. And yeah, it hurts. It hurts while you're washing it. It stings. It's a sharp pain, but you get the bandage on and the pain starts to die down, and a few hours pass, it's down to just a soreness. My point is that truth is the hot, sudsy water with which we wash out the wounds of 9/11 so that they can begin true healing.
Yeah, that was Peter Michael Ketchum from NIST organization. He became a whistleblower now, and he blew the whistle on NIST. And it's just amazing. I mean, it's just amazing that the programming that went on around 9/11, the programming that went on around 9/11, programming people to be deceived is just amazing, and it continues. With the derogatory term conspiracy theorist and so forth. These people that were on the show tonight were not conspiracy theorists, anything but. Barbara Honegger is very well-respected researcher, and she basically caused a congressional investigation to be had over the Iran-Contra affair. And Richard Gage is an architect. 30 years and member of AIA. He's not a conspiracy theorist. He doesn't even talk about, the conspiracy of it. He doesn't talk about that. Do you notice when you have him on the show? He mainly talks about the science of the collapse and how it happened. He talks about the science. And Dave Meiswinkle is an attorney that he's thinking about the law in regard to all of this. And when you're in law, involved in law, you need the truth. You got to have the facts. And Dave doesn't deal with anything else but the facts. So you're hearing from people that are very professional and very, they're not fooling around. This isn't like they don't have anything to do and they're speculating. This has become a life's passion to try to bring justice to an unjust event that happened in our history, right here in our backyard in New York State. I mean, we should be just filled with activists around here. And we do have quite a few 9/11 activists in Woodstock, I must say, people who are aware of it. So I'm not saying anything about Woodstock. I am talking about the country as a whole. Although, the latest polls show something like 60% of Americans know it was an inside job, 9/11. 40% still don't believe, But on that note, I'm going to play an interview. It's kind of like a monologue. He turns it into a monologue, but he's the top-ranking military person in this country that has come out and said that it's not what they said it was. He's specifically referring to the Pentagon. And his name is, I forgot his first name, but he's a general. He's a U.S. Major General. U.S. Major General. Must be in the Army. And he's come out and said that it's not what it was. And you'll hear what he says. He says it better than me. And he's very emphatic about the way he speaks. He's a very interesting person to listen to. But here we go. It's about 20 minutes. Here we go with Major Stubblefield.
Major General Albert Stubblebine spent 32 years of his life serving the US military. At the end of his career, he was in charge of the military's entire strategic intelligence around the world. The following interview follows the process General Stubblebine underwent as he realized and was able to prove that what had hit the Pentagon was not an aeroplane. This is his story.
I'm Major General Albert Newton Stubblebine III, U.S. Army retired. And I spent 32 years in the military. And ended up as a Major General. In my last assignment, I was responsible for all of the Army's strategic intelligence forces around the world. I got sent to Korea early in my life, and I'd been there about a week. And my boss, who was a full colonel, said, report to the SINC. I said, SINC is the commander-in-chief of all forces. So I reported in and saluted, and he said, young man, you are going to redo the North Korean order of battle. Order of battle. Order of battle? I didn't have a clue what that meant. Not a clue. So we went down the same walkway that goes to the mess hall that I'd pass this Quonset hut every time I'd gone to meal. And he unlocks the door, we go in, he said, go over there and take a look. Okay. Walked over and took a look, and I said, holy smokes, because what was there was SR-71 photography. Now, for those who are not familiar, the SR-71 was an early, very high altitude reconnaissance plane. And it was taking photographs anywhere where they needed high altitude photography. I looked at this, wow, because I process my information visually. I'm a very high visual. I'm a visual kino, which is a visual that I process my information by, but I test it kinesthetically by feeling. But I'm primarily a visual. You can see the entire structure of what the North Korean army had created on the other side of the mountain. The net result was that I did put the North Korean order of battle in perspective, presented it to the Sink before I left, and it became his tool for making decisions of where he placed his troops, what he did, how he organized for whatever was coming. Fortunately, nothing ever happened. However, he had the information from my essentially map reading, or photo reading, photo interpretation reading, so that he could make the right decision on how to handle the situation. I actually was responsible for all of the Army's strategic imagery. And when I say imagery, that's not just photo, it's radar, it's all of the different kinds of imagery that you can have. I was responsible for all of the Army's strategic units that do that kind of work. Let me fast forward now, because that brings me to the real intention of where I'm trying to go with this. 9/11. 9/11 happens. At the time, my wife and I were in Hawaii. We were attending a conference, and I think it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 or 3:30 in the morning, I get a phone call. And it's one of my officers. I had retired by that time. It was one of my officers who had served under me, and a fabulous officer. And she said, "Sir, the United States is at war." I said, "See, what are you talking about?" She said, "The United States is at war." I said, "Come on, see, what have you been drinking?" She said, "Listen to me. Go turn on the television. The United States is at war." I said, I still didn't believe. I go turn on the television. Bingo, I see the towers coming down. I said, "Oh, that's a joke." I switched channels, towers going down. I switched channels, towers going down. I said, "Oh my God." So I thanked her for the information. I turned to Rima and I said, "You watch. I guarantee you right now that the information about that attack was in the system and somebody missed it." Very important. The information was there to know that that attack was coming, and somebody didn't see the signals. And that's from my own personal intelligence background. All of my experience after that in the intelligence world tells me that when something that big goes by, somebody missed the information. So I was a believer, absolute believer, that the attack was a terrorist attack, that it was all done by other forces. And after that periods, my wife began to put pieces together, and she said, I don't think that attack was done by the enemy, the terrorists that you indicated. I said, you're wrong. She said, I don't believe it. I said, you're wrong. And so she began to find bits and pieces of information, and she would present them to me, and I said, no, not my government. My government would not tell a lie like that. And I just disbelieved. I was so ingrained in my belief system that I could not believe, I literally could not believe that anybody but a sort of Arab terrorist could do something like that. And then one day, I saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Pentagon and the hole in the Pentagon. And I looked at it and I said, wow. And then I looked at it again. I said, something's wrong. Something's wrong with this picture. Then I kept looking at it. And then I began to not look at it just at a glance, but to study the photograph itself. What's wrong with this picture? Why is your belly saying, my kinesthetic aspect of my processing system, saying something wrong with that picture? Well, there was something wrong. And so I analyzed it, not just photographically, I did measurements, I did all kinds of it. I checked the plane, the length of the nose, where the wings were. I did all of the measurements. I took the measurements of the Pentagon, the depth of the destruction in the Pentagon. Conclusion, airplane did not make that hole. I went public at the time. I am the highest ranking officer, I believe, that has ever gone public. That whatever that story was, the official story, was not true. Now, I was very careful to not say what it was because I couldn't prove it. I was careful to say it was not the airplane that did that, because I can prove that it was not the airplane. In the hole, however, was a turbine. Looked like the turbine from a missile. I can't prove that, I don't know, but there was something there that did not look like the engine from an airplane, but did look like a turbine from a missile. Later, I saw another photograph of one of the sensors on the outside of the Pentagon. Now, all of the sensors had been turned off, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? That day, why would all of the sensors around the Pentagon be turned off? Ooh, that's strange. I don't care what the excuse is, that's strange. There happened to be one that apparently did not get turned off, and in that picture, coming in, flying into the Pentagon, you see this object. And it obviously hits the Pentagon. When you look at it, it does not look like an airplane. Later, sometime later, after I'd gone public, that imagery was changed. It had, it got a new suit around it that now looked like an airplane. But when you take the suit off, it looks more like a missile, not like an airplane. Let me go back to the next, I think, very important piece of information. The amount of energy required to melt the girders, the steel in the tower, cannot be gotten to a melt point with the fuel that was in the airplane. Not possible. So any melting did not occur as a result of the hit from the airplane. Point. I call it dot, okay? Dot. When you look at the tower coming down, what you see are at each floor successive puffs of smoke. Puff, 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 all the way down. What are the puffs of smoke coming from? Well, they claim they're from the collapsing floors. No, no, no. Those puffs of smoke are controlled demolitions. That's exactly what they are, because that's exactly how they work. And so the fact that the airplane hit, it did not cause that collapse of the building. The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition. Fact. Building 7. Silverberg, I believe is the name of the owner, was on video, and you could see Building 7. You could literally see it. And there was a fire in Building 7. There's no doubt about that. No airplane hit it. I assume that the fire came from some debris, but I'm not even sure of that. But in the lower right-hand corner of the building was a fire. Not a very big fire, didn't appear to be out of control, certainly was in a small part of the building. But then he is heard on the video, okay? And he says, "Pull it." And then the building collapsed. What does pull it mean? What do the words pull it mean? Let me tell you. That's the order for controlled demolition. That is the phraseology that's used for blowing up something. And that's when Building 7 blew up. I understand, I can't prove this, but I've heard that he had just reinsured the building for damages caused by such things as airplanes hitting it or some objects hitting it that had not been in the original contract. Now, I can't prove that. I don't know, but I've heard that. There was another data bit. All of the air defense systems in that part of the country had been turned off that day. All of the air defense systems had been turned off. Why? Apparently because the vice president was out in Colorado and he ordered them turned off. Why would you turn off all of the air defense systems on that particular day unless you knew something was going to happen? It's a dot. It's information. But strange that everything got turned off that day. Dot. There was an exercise that was designed for the air defense systems that was an attack on the towers by airplanes. Isn't that strange that we had an exercise that mimicked what really happened? Strange that we had planned an exercise that was exactly what happened. And at the same time, the air defense systems were turned off. Don't you find that strange? I find that weirdly strange. Dot, yeah, just a piece of information. But how does it correlate with everything else? See, so you see the dots. You have all of these dots. They're just bits of information. But that's exactly how the intelligence world works. You get a bit of information here, you get an information here, a bit here, and a bit here, and pretty soon you got a picture. To me, what does the picture say? Picture says that what we heard and were told in the newspapers, the media, was not the real story. If there's enough doubt in the official story where the stories are absolutely not consistent with what happened, that they paint a different picture than the one that was given to the media, how easy is it for you to shift your belief system from I totally believe in my government to oh my God, what's going on? And that's exactly where I went in all of this. Because my belief system is so strong from age 5 when I can remember standing on the parade ground at attention with not anybody telling me to do that at West Point. I did it because I wanted to do it, because I believed. And then going to the military academy, serving, defending. The real story was, or I have a question, I guess. The real story to me is, who was the real enemy? Who participated in this? Who planned this attack? Why was it planned? Were the real terrorists the people in Arab clothing, or were the real people that planned this the people sitting in the authority in the White House?
The debate surrounding the official story of September 11.
Okay, that was U.S. Major General Albert Stubblebine. I had his name wrong. Albert Stubblebine. And he's an incredible guy. I mean, you know, he's totally been trained as a military person his whole life. But you know what? I say, if you're a military person, you should be on top of this more than the average guy, more than the average woman. What do you call it? That's not not an officer, not a military person, and
Civilian.
Civilian, yeah, not a civilian. You're in the military. You should know what happened. That it wasn't what they said happened. Come on, buildings don't collapse exactly like controlled demolition. No building has ever collapsed identical to controlled demolition. That wasn't controlled demolition. That's never happened before. And that's what we had. We had buildings that collapsed identical to controlled demolition that they claim wasn't controlled demolition. Anybody that worked in the military, worked with explosives, knows that was controlled demolition. If you want to see more than what we've shown here tonight, I highly recommend that every person that wants to find out more, go to ae911truth.org and watch or you can go to YouTube, watch the movie 9/11 Explosive Evidence, The Experts Speak Out. Because there's architects, there's engineers, there's a Nobel laureate in there who's a science major, specializes in science. There's military people, there's controlled demolition people, all in this movie, and they're explaining exactly why it can't be anything other than controlled demolition. Okay? So I would definitely watch that movie if you haven't seen it. I would also watch the other movie by Richard Gage called, what is it called? Blueprint for Truth. It's called Blueprint for Truth, something destruction. But anyway, if you just look up Blueprint for Truth on YouTube, you'll find it. It's a must-see film. And then another one is another good one is another one by Richard Gage called Firemen, Architects and Engineers. What's the word? Debunk? No. There's another word. The Myths of 9/11. And I can't think of the word, but if you just put that in there, it'll come up. It's actually their latest movie was Firemen, Architects and Engineers, and it's a big, heavy element of fireman perspective on all of this. Another one you have to see, it's only 10 minutes. Those are all about an hour, hour and a half. I think they're all hours except for Fireman is an hour and a half. But another one is, and I mentioned it earlier, is 9/11 firefighter blows the lid off the 9/11 cover-up. Must see, must listen to. Key stuff there. Another one is really September 11th, the new Pearl Harbor. This is September 11th, the new Pearl Harbor is a 5-hour video. You don't have to watch it all at once, but if you want to know the facts, watch this movie. September 11th, the new Pearl Harbor. It's on YouTube, and watch an hour, 5 days, and it reveals every fact that you need to know about 9/11, and it's all pretty amazing stuff. When you look at it and you see the facts, and they know, and they want us to be deceived, then and the newspapers are in on it. The newspapers are in on it because they, have kept this down to a minimum. Discussion on 9/11, and they've made people that speak about these things like Richard Gage and Barbara Honegger and Dave Meiswinkle and other people, and I've experienced it myself in the newspapers. People attacking me because I'm bringing up the facts. They have no facts. I have the facts. So does Richard Gage, and so does Barbara Honegger and Dave Meiswinkle. Have the facts. That's all we deal with is the science and the facts, not speculation. The facts. So these people wanted a war that were behind this. They wanted a war in the Middle East, and they got it. And one more thing. Anybody who wants to know, could my government possibly do this? If you want the answer to that, in their own words, go to DuckDuckGo, a search engine, and type in Operation Northwoods. It's a 15-page document. Make sure you read the official document and read what they had planned in 1962. Kennedy said no, and he was assassinated a year later from when he said no. We're not going to go ahead with this. But it was the same plan as what happened on 9/11 that they wanted to do in 1962. Crashing planes into buildings in the United States, in Miami, Washington. But Kennedy said no, because we had a real president then. But they killed him too. But anyway, they wanted a war, and that's what they got, and it's a forever war. They want to keep on going, and they keep on making money, and they keep getting more power and strip our constitutional rights, all because of the phony story on 9/11. So that's the bottom line, and these people are merchants of death. So here we go. This is our final song for the night. Final thing for the night will be a song by Mr. Tom Pacheco.
He might be the kindly uncle who never talks a flag of whatever cause, a country that'll pay him most. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's quite proud of his shrapnel factory. His munitions plant works full time. He looks like your ordinary salesman who contributes to the March of Dimes. He might own a gold Mercedes, a beach house in Key Biscayne. You may not see any blood on his hands, but it's leaking from his soul like rain. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's got bank accounts in Baghdad, investments in Paraguay. He shakes hands with the KGB and plays cards with the CIA. Do you need warplanes? That's easy. His connections always connect. He's never felt guilt for the pain he's caused or the innocent lives he's wrecked. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death. He's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death, he's a merchant of death.
Okay, folks, that's what we have up there at the heads of our government is merchants of death, because that's all they want is wars, and you know, it's just very sickening that it continues. Democrats and Republicans alike, they all vote for wars and more military and more weapons of mass destruction and just all kinds of stuff. It's sickening, but we got to change it, and we got to work from the bottom up. And that's what we're doing here at the Woodstock 104 and Woodstock Truth Squad. And thanks for tuning in, folks. And we'll see you next week. Have a happy new year. In spite of what we're up against, have a happy new year. And we can change it if we all get together and give it an effort. Good night now.